Before you think about anything else today, consider this one fact. The largest contiguous land empire in all of human history, larger than Rome, larger than Alexander's empire, larger than the British Empire at its height, was not built by a dynasty with centuries of preparation behind it. It was not built by a naval superpower or a god-king born into marble halls and inherited armies. It was built by a 9-year-old boy, a boy whose father had just been poisoned, whose clan had just abandoned him and his mother and his younger siblings on the open steppe to die. A boy with no army, no wealth, no protector, and no guarantee of surviving the coming winter. His name was Temujin, and what he built from that moment of total abandonment is, without exaggeration, one of the most consequential stories in the entire history of human civilization. This is that story. To understand what Temujin became, you first have to understand the world that made him. The Mongolian plateau sits at the heart of the Eurasian continent like a vast, breathing lung. It stretches for roughly 1 million square miles, a landscape of sweeping grassland, punishing desert, and mountain ranges so old they have forgotten their own height. The steppe is not empty, but insists on certain terms before it will sustain you. It will give you grass. It will give you wind. It will give you a sky so enormous that travelers who crossed it for the first time often reported feeling that the earth had been turned inside out. What will not give you is softness. The climate of the Mongolian plateau swings between extremes that most of human history has never had to negotiate. Winters reach temperatures of 40 degrees below zero. The growing season is short and merciless. There's almost no standing timber. There's almost no cultivable soil. And yet for thousands of years, the peoples of the steppe had not only survived here. They had built entire civilizations around what the land demanded of them. The answer always was the horse. The nomadic peoples of the steppe were not riders who happened to be warriors. They were something closer to a biological fusion with the animal itself. Mongol children were placed on horseback before they could walk steadily on their own feet. By adulthood, a Mongol herder could spend entire days in the saddle, sleeping, eating, navigating, and hunting without dismounting. The horse was transportation, food, drink. Mare's milk was a dietary staple, companion, and weapon all at once. This relationship with the horse produced a particular kind of human being, one who thought in terms of movement rather than permanence, one who measured wealth in livestock rather than land, one who understood that survival required the ability to read weather, terrain, animal behavior, and the intentions of strangers at a distance of half a mile. It also produced a particular kind of society. Steppe life organized itself around the clan. The clan was everything, the unit of protection, of resource sharing, of identity. Beyond the clan sat larger confederacies of related tribes, bound by blood, by marriage, by oath, and often by the shared memory of old grievances. Because the steppe offered no natural barriers, no walls, no moats, security came only from alliance or from dominance. And dominance was always temporary. The 12th century on the Mongolian plateau was a world in perpetual, grinding war with itself. The Mongols, the Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, the Karaits, these were not abstractions. They were distinct peoples with their own customs, their own leadership structures, their own centuries of mutual raiding and revenge. The Tatars poisoned Mongol chieftains. The Mongols raided Tatar herds. The Merkits stole Mongol women. And on, generation after generation, the wheel of reprisal turned and turned and turned. No single tribe had ever managed to stop the wheel. No single leader had ever found the argument that was larger than blood feud, more compelling than clan loyalty, more durable than the next raid, until one did. The historical record places the birth of Temujin at around the year 1162, near the banks of the Onon River in what is now northeastern Mongolia. His father was Yasuji, a man of the Kiad clan of the Borjigin Mongols, not a great Khan, but a man of standing. A warrior with alliances and enemies in roughly equal measure. The story of Temujin's very name is itself a window into the world he was born into. The day Yasuji returned home from battle, Having captured a Tatar chieftain named Temujin, his wife Holon gave birth to their first son. According to Mongol custom, a child born in a moment of victory carries the spirit of that moment. The boy was named Temujin, a name taken from a defeated enemy, meant to transfer that enemy's power into the life of the child. It was a tradition soaked in the logic of the steppe. Nothing is wasted. Everything is converted. Holon herself had come to Yasuji through a practice that was, by the standards of the steppe, entirely unremarkable, even if it strikes modern ears as something else entirely. She had been abducted from her first husband, a Merkit man, while the two were traveling together. Yasuji had wanted her, taken her, and that was that. She bore him 5 children. She would raise them alone. Temujin was perhaps 9 years old. The sources vary slightly, as they often do for this period. When Yasuji took him to the nearby Ongjarat tribe to find a suitable future wife, as was the custom. The girl chosen was Borte, a daughter of the Ongjarat chief, judged to be a good match. Temujin was left with Borte's family while the betrothal arrangement settled. He was riding home alone when he encountered a group of Tatar men on the trail. Yasuji stopped to share food with them, as steppe hospitality required. He did not know that they recognized him. He did not know that they had slipped slow poison into his food. By the time he reached home, he was dying. He sent for his son. Temujin rode back as fast as he could. He arrived in time to hear his father's last words and to watch him die. And then the clan left. This is the fact that has to be sat with for a moment, because it is the furnace in which everything that followed was forged. The Kiad clan, the people Yasuji had led and protected, looked at his widow and his young children and made a calculation. A woman with small children was a drain on resources. A 9-year-old boy was not a protector. The steppe was not a place for sentiment. They packed up the jairs, the round felt tents that were the homes of the nomadic Mongols, and they moved on, taking the herds with them. They left Holon and her children with almost nothing. No livestock, no male protectors, no clan alliance. Winter coming. On the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century, this was not a hardship. It was a sentence. What followed was an adolescence that reads, even at this distance of 9 centuries, like something almost too extreme to be born. Holon fed her children on roots, berries, and whatever small game they could hunt from the river. She was ferocious in her determination. The Secret History of the Mongols, the oldest surviving Mongolian literary work, written within a generation of Temujin's death, describes her ranging along the Onon River, digging for wild garlic, gathering bird cherries, gathering everything the land would yield, keeping her children alive through sheer refusal to stop. Temujin and his brothers fished. They hunted marmots with bone-tipped arrows. They learned, in the most unforgiving school imaginable, what it meant to survive without a safety net. And then came the moment that tells you more about Temujin than almost any other in his early life. He had a half-brother named Begtur, older than his full brothers, born of a different mother. In the brutal arithmetic of their circumstances, Begtur had begun to assert dominance over the food supply, hoarding, taking first, making the calculus of scarcity work in his favor at the expense of the others. Temujin and his brother Kasar took their bows and killed him. There is no softening of this. It was the murder of a half-brother over food. Holon, the secret history tells us, was furious, comparing her sons to dogs and wolves devouring their own kind. And she was not wrong. It was a brutal act, but it was also a statement. Temujin, even at this age, was already operating on a principle that would define his entire life. Within the unit, loyalty must be absolute and hierarchy must serve the collective. Those who broke that principle, even family, were a threat to survival. And survival came first. He would hold to that principle for the rest of his life, with consequences that would shake the world. The steppe did not grant him a period of quiet growth. Not long after, Temujin was captured by the Taichiyuti clan, old rivals of his father who had no desire to see a grown son of Yasuji become a power in the region. He was fitted with a kang, a heavy wooden collar used to restrain prisoners, and held as a slave. He escaped. The details in the historical record have the texture of legend. but the core fact is not in doubt. He got out. He hid in a river, submerged to his neck to evade searchers, aided by a sympathetic family who sheltered him at considerable personal risk. He made it back to his mother. He was still a teenager. He had been abandoned, orphaned, nearly starved, and enslaved. He had survived all of it, and now he turned toward the future. He retrieved Borte from her family, honoring the betrothal his father had arranged. She would become the great constant of his life, his principal wife, his most trusted counselor, the mother of his heirs, the person whose judgment he sought until the end. The marriage barely had time to settle before catastrophe struck again. A Merkit raiding party, seeking revenge for the abduction of Holan by Yasuji I all those years before, swept down on the camp in the night. Temujin escaped into the mountains. Borte was taken. For a lesser man, that might have been the end of it. Wives were taken on the steppe. It was a brutal reality. You mourned and you moved on. Temujin did not move on. He built a coalition. He called on two relationships. The first was Togrul, the Khan of the Kharet tribe, who had once been a sworn ally of Yasuji I and who owed the old man debts of loyalty. The second was Jamuka, a boy from his own clan with whom Temujin had formed one of those deep, sworn brotherhoods that the steppe culture formalized as Anda, blood brothers, bound to each other above clan, above self. Together, the three forces swept into Merkit territory, shattered their camps, and recovered Borte. This was not simply a rescue. It was the first demonstration of something new. Temujin's ability to build, hold, and direct a coalition across clan lines. To call in old debts and activate new ones. To move quickly and strike decisively. To transform personal injury into political action. The steppe was paying attention. The decade that followed was a long, grinding, brilliant campaign of political and military consolidation. Temujin began to attract followers in a way that was genuinely novel. On the steppe, you followed your clan chief because he was your clan chief. Blood determined loyalty. Temujin offered something else. He offered a system. Those who joined him were rewarded based on what they contributed, not on who their father was. Captured enemies who submitted and served loyally were absorbed. Those who fought to the last and maintained honor were respected. Those who betrayed their own masters to curry favor with Temujin were executed, because a man who betrayed his previous lord would betray his next one. This was not mere pragmatism. It was a coherent philosophy of human nature, worked out on the job, in conditions of mortal urgency. His ranks grew, his reputation spread, and the old tribal system began to feel the pressure of something it had never quite encountered. A leader who was building for something larger than his own clan's advantage. His old Anda, Jamuka, became his most dangerous rival. They had ridden together, fought together, shared a tent. They had also diverged in what kind of world they were building toward. Jamuka was a gifted leader, but he led in the old way, for clan, for blood, for the existing order. Temujin was leading towards something that had no precedent. They fought each other across years, and in the end, Temujin prevailed. When Jamuka was finally brought before him, abandoned by his own followers, the last of his allies gone, Temujin offered him mercy, offered him a place at his side, as it had been in the beginning. Jamuka refused. He asked for a noble death, death without the shedding of blood, as befitted a man of stature on the steppe. Temujin wept. The secret history of the Mongols says so plainly, without embarrassment, and then he granted his blood brother's request. The man who had once been his closest companion, his chosen brother, was gone. The steppe now had one ruler. In the spring of the year 1206, on the banks of the Onan River, the same river where Temujin had been born, where he had survived abandonment, where he had fished for food as a starving child, the representatives of every Mongol and steppe tribe gathered for a great Kurultai, a congress. A reckoning. A white standard of 9 tails was raised against the sky. It was the banner of the unified Mongol nation, and a man rose before his people. He was in his mid-40s. He had been abandoned, enslaved, and raided. He had lost his wife and recovered her. He had killed a brother and mourned a friend. He had spent his entire adult life in the saddle, building the thing that now surrounded him. a unified steppe nation of perhaps 1.5 million people, commanding perhaps 100,000 of the most effective warriors on the surface of the earth. The assembly gave him a name, Genghis Khan. It has been translated as universal ruler, as oceanic ruler, as the ruler of all. The precise etymology is still debated by scholars, but the meaning in that moment was not in doubt. One man, one nation, one will, and beyond the steppe, barely aware of what had just happened in that remote river valley, the great civilizations of the medieval world continued their business as they always had. They would not continue it for long. That boy on the Onon River, the one left to die with nothing, had not simply survived. He had observed everything the world put him through and converted it into knowledge. He knew what abandonment felt like, so he understood loyalty at its root. He knew what betrayal cost, so he punished it with perfect consistency. He knew what it meant to have no resources and no protectors, so he built systems designed so that no one who served him faithfully would ever be left with nothing. The cruelties inflicted on him became the architecture of his empire. This is not to romanticize what came next. What came next was, in many places, a catastrophe of staggering proportions. The scale of violence that would flow from that riverbank ceremony in 1206 belongs in the full accounting, and it will receive it. But before the world met Genghis Khan the Conqueror, it ought to know something about Temujin the Child, about what the steppe made of him, about what he made of the steppe, and about the extraordinary, terrible, world-altering thing that happens when a system built for survival is finally given an empire-sized stage to perform on. There is a question that historians, military strategists, and philosophers have been asking for 8 centuries now. How did they do it? How did a nation of nomadic herders, with no cities, no standing infrastructure, no navy, no siege tradition, and a total population smaller than many medieval cities, how did they, in the span of a single generation, shatter the greatest military powers on Earth one by one, and build the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever seen? The answer is not simple. It is not one thing. It is a system. And to understand what Genghis Khan unleashed on the world after 1206, you first have to understand the machine he had spent a lifetime building. Because what rode out of the Mongolian steppe in the early 13th century was not just an army. It was something the world had never faced before, and in many ways has never faced since. Begin with the horse. Not the horse as a romantic symbol. Not the horse as a backdrop to the drama. The horse as a military technology so sophisticated that its implications are still underappreciated today. Every Mongol warrior rode to war with a string of horses. Not one, not two, typically between 3 and 5 animals, sometimes more, rotating through them constantly so that no single horse was ever fully exhausted. The practical consequence of this was an army that could sustain a pace of movement that defied everything the medieval world understood about the speed of military force. A conventional medieval European army, moving at the pace of its infantry and its supply wagons, might cover 15 to 20 miles on a good day. A Mongol force, riding light and rotating mounts, could cover 60, 70, sometimes 100 miles in a single day. Not as a sprint, as a sustained operational tempo. This was not just fast. It was a different category of movement entirely. It meant that by the time an enemy received word that a Mongol army was in the region, that army might already be at the gates. It meant that retreat was not a reliable option. It meant that the Mongol army could appear at a time and place of its own choosing with a consistency that seemed, to those on the receiving end, almost supernatural. The horses were Mongolian steppe ponies, smaller than the war horses of Europe or Persia, less impressive to look at, but extraordinarily hardy. They could dig through snow to find grass. They could survive on forage that would starve another breed. They required no grain supply train, which meant the Mongol army carried almost none of the logistical burden that slowed every other military force on Earth. Add to this the Mongol composite bow, crafted from layers of horn, sinew, and wood, laminated together under tension and shaped into a recurved form that stored enormous energy. This weapon had an effective range of over 200 yards from standing position. From horseback, at full gallop, a trained Mongol archer could put 5 arrows into the air per minute with lethal accuracy. Think about what that means tactically. An army of 10,000 Mongol horsemen, each carrying 60 arrows, could release 50,000 arrows per minute from a moving platform at ranges that put them beyond effective retaliation from most opposing infantry. This was not cavalry. This was mobile artillery. But the weapon and the horse, remarkable as they were, only tell part of the story. What made the Mongol military machine genuinely revolutionary was its organizational structure. Genghis Khan dismantled the tribal military system of the steppe and rebuilt it from the ground up. The old structure had been tribal. You fought beside your clansmen, under your clan's chief, for your clan's interests. Loyalty was horizontal. Command was inherited. Genghis replaced all of this with a decimal system. Every soldier belonged to a unit of 10, called an arban. 10 arbans formed a unit of 100, called a jagan. 10 jagans formed a unit of 1,000, called a mingan. 10 mingans formed a unit of 10,000, called a tuman. At every level, the commander was appointed on the basis of demonstrated ability. Not bloodline, not clan, not seniority. Ability. A common herder who showed tactical brilliance could rise to command a tuman, 10,000 men. A nobleman's son who showed weakness or disloyalty could be stripped of command and demoted without ceremony. This was in the context of the 12th and 13th centuries, a radical act. In a world organized entirely around hereditary privilege, Genghis Khan had created a meritocracy of violence. He also did something else that no steppe leader had ever successfully managed. He broke up the clan formations. Men from different tribes, different clans, different backgrounds were mixed together into the same units. Your arban was not your family. It was your new family. You ate with them, trained with them, and died with them. And your loyalty to that unit was absolute, enforced by a law that held every member of a 10-man unit responsible if any one of them deserted. The effect was profound. The old tribal loyalties that had fragmented the steppe for centuries were not eliminated. They were redirected. The energy that had once gone into interclan raiding was now pointed outward at the world beyond the steppe. The Mongol army's tactical vocabulary was equally sophisticated. The feigned retreat was its most famous technique. A Mongol force would engage the enemy, then apparently break and flee in apparent panic. The enemy would pursue, because pursuit of a fleeing enemy was the universal instinct of medieval cavalry. And as they pursued, the Mongols would draw them out of formation, stretch their lines, separate their units. And then, at a prearranged signal, the Mongol riders would swing around, reform with terrifying speed, and envelope their pursuers from multiple directions simultaneously. This technique, called the tuluma, worked not once or twice, but repeatedly against enemies who had been warned about it, because it required the pursuing force to override its own instincts in the heat of battle. And most forces, most of the time, could not do that. Alongside the tuluma sat a deep tradition of what we would today call intelligence operations. Before any major campaign, Mongol scouts and an extensive network of merchants, travelers, and informants mapped the target territory with extraordinary thoroughness. Road conditions, river crossings, the disposition of enemy forces, the internal political divisions of the enemy leadership, the locations of food and water sources, all of this was gathered, analyzed, and fed into campaign planning before a single soldier moved. Genghis Khan did not launch campaigns. He prosecuted them with the patience, precision, and systemic intelligence of a general operating at a level of strategic sophistication that would not be matched in Europe for several more centuries. And then, when he needed something he did not have, he acquired it. The Mongol army began as a purely cavalry force, suited to the open steppe. The steppe, however, was not the world. And the world, particularly the world to the south and west, was full of cities. Cities meant walls. Walls meant siegecraft, and siegecraft was the one domain in which the Mongol army, in its original form, had no expertise whatsoever. Genghis Khan solved this problem with a clarity of logic that defined his generalship. He found the people who had the expertise, and he put them to work. As the Mongols began their expansion into the settled world, they systematically identified and absorbed the engineers, the craftsmen, the siege specialists, and the technical minds of every civilization they encountered. Chinese engineers brought catapult technology and a knowledge of gunpowder-based weapons. Persian engineers contributed their own traditions of fortification and its defeat. Specialists from Central Asia brought trebuchet designs and operational knowledge. The Mongol army became, over the course of its first decade of major campaigning, a combined arms force of extraordinary versatility. Light cavalry for speed and envelopment, heavy cavalry for shock, massed archery for suppression, and siege equipment, catapults, trebuchets, ballistas, and incendiary devices, operated by conscripted specialists under Mongol command. The world had built its walls to keep out the steppe. The steppe had learned to climb them. The first major test of this machine against a great civilizational power came in the south. China in the early 13th century was not a unified empire. It was divided, roughly, between the Jin dynasty in the north, a Jurchen people who had themselves come from Manchuria to dominate northern China, and the southern Song dynasty further south. The Jin controlled the Yellow River Basin, the North China Plain, the ancient capitals, and a population of perhaps 50 million people. They also controlled something Genghis Khan considered an outrage. For years, the Jin had extracted tribute from the Mongol tribes, using the classic strategy of playing steppe peoples against one another to prevent any one of them from becoming too powerful. They had, in fact, assisted in the poisoning of Yasujii. They had collaborated in keeping the Mongols divided and weak. Genghis Khan had a long memory. The campaign against the Jin began in 1211. It did not begin as a war of total conquest, at least not initially. It began as a demonstration, a series of devastating raids that showed the Jin what the unified Mongol nation was capable of and what it expected in return. The Jin's response was not adequate, and so the raids became invasions. The invasions became sieges, and the sieges, now equipped with the captured Chinese engineering knowledge that the early campaigns had secured, began to produce results that stunned the Jin military establishment. Mongol forces moved through the Jin frontier defenses, including the substantial northern wall systems that predated the more famous later Great Wall, with a combination of direct assault, psychological pressure, and the patient work of siege engines. Towns and fortresses that held out were reduced. Towns that surrendered were spared and frequently absorbed into the Mongol administrative apparatus. The calculus was deliberate and consistent. Resistance meant destruction, submission meant survival, and a new set of obligations. The Jin moved their capital south from Zhongdu, the city we now call Beijing, to Kaifeng, hoping to place more distance between themselves and the Mongol advance. It was an acknowledgement of vulnerability that reverberated through the political landscape of Asia. In 1215, Zhongdu fell, a city of perhaps 1 million people, one of the great metropolises of the medieval world. The smoke from its burning, according to contemporaries, rose for weeks. The Mongols were not finished with China. The complete subjugation of the Jin would take another 2 decades and would be completed not by Genghis himself, but by his successors. But the 1215 campaign had demonstrated something of world historical importance. The Mongol army could take cities. The walls of civilization were not a boundary. They were an obstacle, and the Mongols had become very, very good at obstacles. It was in the West, however, that the next act would play out, and it would begin not with an army, but with a caravan. In 1218, Genghis Khan dispatched a trade mission to the Khwarezmian Empire. The Khwarezmian Empire in the early 13th century was one of the great powers of the medieval world. It stretched from the Caspian Sea to the Persian Gulf, encompassing what is now Iran, most of modern Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and parts of several other modern nations. Its ruler, Shah Allah ad-Din Muhammad II, controlled the great Silk Road cities, Samarkand, Bokhara, Urgench, Merv, ancient centers of Islamic civilization, scholarship, and trade that had been accumulating wealth and knowledge for centuries. The Shah considered himself, with some justification, a major world power. The trade mission Genghis sent numbered perhaps 450 merchants, accompanied by diplomats bearing a message of peace and an interest in establishing formal trade relations. Genghis Khan understood, with the commercial instincts that would define the empire's mature period, that a peaceful, profitable relationship with Khwarezm was worth more than a war. The caravan reached the Khwarezmian border city of Otrar, and there, the governor of Otrar, a man named Inalchuk, who was also the Shah's uncle, made a decision that changed the history of the world. He accused the merchants of being spies. He had them all killed, and he seized their goods. When word reached Genghis Khan, he sent a formal diplomatic mission directly to the Shah, demanding justice, the extradition of Inalchuk and reparations for the murdered merchants, a minimum threshold of accountability between sovereign powers. Shah Muhammad executed the lead ambassador and sent the others back with their beards shaved off, one of the most severe insults one ruler could direct at another in the medieval world. And in that moment, with that gesture, the Shah of Khwarezm signed the death warrant of his entire civilization. The campaign that followed, from 1219 to 1221, is one that historians still struggle to contain within the ordinary vocabulary of military history. What Genghis Khan unleashed on the Khwarezmian Empire was not simply a military campaign. It was a systematic, precisely orchestrated act of total strategic destruction, executed at a speed and on a scale that the medieval world had no framework to comprehend. He moved his forces in multiple columns, an approach that divided the defending forces, prevented any concentration of resistance, and created the overwhelming sensation in the Khwarezmian military command that they were being attacked from everywhere simultaneously. Because they were. Bokhara, one of the great cities of the Islamic world, a center of scholarship and culture, home to the libraries and academies that had made Central Asia an intellectual lighthouse for centuries, fell in February of 1220. Genghis Khan is reported to have ridden into the city's great mosque and addressed the assembled population from the pulpit. He told them he was the punishment of God, and that if they had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like him. Whether those were his exact words is impossible to verify, but they have the ring of a man who had thought carefully about the meaning of what he was doing. Samarkand, the jewel of Khwarezm, one of the most magnificent cities in the medieval world, fell shortly after. Its population was divided. Craftsmen and specialists were taken into Mongol service. The remainder received various fates depending on the degree of resistance offered. Urgench, the capital, resisted longer. It was reduced almost to rubble. The Mongols, according to historical accounts, diverted a river to flood the remains. Merv, ancient Merv, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on the Silk Road, a city that had stood for thousands of years, fell and was largely destroyed. The historical sources that survive from this period record population losses that have generated enormous scholarly debate for centuries. Persian chronicles cite figures that, if taken literally, would constitute some of the worst demographic catastrophes in human history. Modern historians approach these numbers with caution, noting that medieval chroniclers routinely worked with imprecise or exaggerated figures, and that the political context of Persian historiography of the period shaped how losses were recorded and remembered. What is not in dispute is this. The Khwarezmian Empire was destroyed, completely, permanently, in 2 years. Cities that had stood since antiquity were reduced to ruins from which some never recovered. The sophisticated irrigation systems of Central Asia, the engineering infrastructure on which entire agricultural civilizations depended, were damaged in ways that took generations to repair. The scale of human displacement across the region was enormous, and Genghis Khan did not consider it finished until he had pursued the Shah himself to the ends of the earth. Shah Muhammad fled west, then south, then west again, always one step ahead of the Mongol pursuit force that Genghis had dispatched under his two greatest generals, Jebe and Subutai. The Shah died on a small island in the Caspian Sea, reportedly of pleurisy, alone and abandoned by his former subjects. stripped of everything. Exactly as a 9-year-old boy had once been stripped of everything on the banks of the Onon River. The destruction is real. It must be accounted for, but it cannot be the only account, because running in parallel with everything the Mongol war machine destroyed, there was a system being built. And that system, in a long view of history, matters as much as the campaigns. Genghis Khan was not simply a general. He was a lawgiver, an administrator, and a strategist of civilization as well as of battle. The Yasa, the great law code of the Mongol Empire, was not written down in a single document, but its principles were consistent and enforced. No enslaving of fellow Mongols, no stealing of livestock, respect for the religious practices of all peoples under Mongol rule, a guarantee of safe passage for diplomats and merchants, death for those who violated that guarantee. That last principle was not incidental. It was foundational. Trade was the circulatory system of the Mongol imperial project. Genghis Khan understood, with a clarity unusual for a conqueror, that a destroyed trading partner was a loss. A functioning, tribute-paying, commercially active vassal was an asset. The empire was not built to consume the world. It was built, in his vision of it, to organize the world under a single administration that would allow commerce and communication to flow freely. The choice of the Uyghur script as the official written language of the empire, adopted because the Mongols had none of their own, was another act of deliberate system building. The empire needed to communicate across enormous distances. It needed a bureaucracy. Genghis Khan found the people who could build one and gave them the authority to do so. Religious tolerance was not a modern virtue awkwardly retrofitted onto Genghis Khan. It was a practical policy rooted in the shamanic traditions of the steppe, which had always been relatively open to the spiritual practices of others, and reinforced by the political reality that an empire as diverse as the Mongols were building could not afford sectarian warfare from within. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and practitioners of local traditions all operated under Mongol protection, provided they paid their taxes and kept their peace. The man who burned Bokhara was the same man who guaranteed the safety of its survivors' places of worship. This is the discomfort at the center of Genghis Khan. He does not resolve into a simple verdict. He never did. He never will. The campaigns of 1222 and 1223 sent the shadow of Mongol power even further west, in the form of a reconnaissance in force that must be counted among the most extraordinary military expeditions in history. Two of Genghis Khan's finest generals, Jib and Subutai, were dispatched with approximately 20,000 men on a sweeping arc through Persia, through Georgia and Armenia, through the Caucasus, and into the southern Russian steppe. This was not a conquest. It was a reconnaissance, a strategic survey of the lands that lay beyond the current edge of the empire. They defeated the Georgians. They defeated an Alan-Cuman coalition in the northern Caucasus. They destroyed a Cuman army on the open steppe and drove the survivors into alliance with the Rus princes to the north. And then, at the Battle of the Kalkar River in the spring of 1223, a combined force of Rus princes and Cuman warriors, perhaps 80,000 men in total, met the Mongol force in open battle. The Mongols destroyed them, not simply defeated them, destroyed them. Multiple Rus princes died. The survivors fled. Those who were captured were placed under wooden boards, on top of which the victorious Mongol commanders held their victory feast, a death without bloodshed, considered a form of honor in Mongol tradition, and a final, chilling message to the civilizations that lay to the west. We have been here. We have seen you. We know the way back. Jib and Subutai then swung east and rejoined the main Mongol army. The entire expedition had covered thousands of miles through multiple civilizations in roughly 2 years. Europe had no idea what had just knocked on its door. In the summer of 1227, Genghis Khan rode out on what would be his final campaign. The target was the Xia, a kingdom in northwestern China whose rulers had failed at a critical moment in the Khwarezmian War to provide the military assistance they had pledged. On the steppe, a broken promise was not a diplomatic incident. It was a debt. He was in his mid-60s. He had been at war, effectively, for 40 years. He had ridden further, planned more. and endured more than any reasonable estimate of human capacity would have predicted possible. The Xia campaign was proceeding toward its conclusion when Genghis Khan died. The exact circumstances remain, deliberately, unknown. The historical sources offer different accounts: a fall from a horse, a fever, an old wound reopened. The Mongols guarded the secret of his death with the same ferocity with which they had guarded his person and life. His body was carried back to Mongolia. He was buried in the Khwarezmian Mountains, in a location that was kept absolutely secret. The funeral cortege killed everyone they encountered on the road to prevent the location from being disclosed. The gravesite has never been definitively found. He left no monument, no pyramid, no mausoleum, no tomb that tourists visit today. He left instead a world transformed. At the moment of his death, the Mongol Empire covered roughly 12 million square miles. It was the largest empire in the world, and it was, at that moment, still less than half the size it would eventually reach. It is worth pausing on that. In the 21 years between the Kurultai of 1206 and the death of Genghis Khan in 1227, his armies had conquered territory at a rate that no military force in history had ever matched. They had dismantled the Jin dynasty of northern China, destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, subdued the Xia, and sent reconnaissance forces to the edges of Europe and the depths of Persia. And he had done it with an army that numbered, at its absolute peak, perhaps 120,000 men. 120,000. For comparison, the city of Samarkand at the time of its fall had a larger population than the entire Mongol military that conquered it. This is the number that stops military historians in their tracks, even today, because it makes no logical sense until you understand what that army actually was. Not a mass of bodies, a system of extraordinary efficiency, flexibility, speed, and intelligence. A system designed from first principles, tested in the harshest laboratory on Earth, and led by a man who had understood human nature, its loyalties, its fears, its vanities, and its breaking points since he was 9 years old. The paradox of Genghis Khan is one that history hands us without resolution and asks us to carry. He destroyed, with a thoroughness and efficiency that is still staggering to contemplate, civilizations that had taken centuries to build. The libraries of Khwarezm, the irrigation systems of Central Asia, the populations of cities that had stood since before Rome. He also created, with equal deliberateness, the conditions for a connected world that had never existed before. He built the first truly Eurasian empire. He protected trade across a distance of thousands of miles. He established the principle of religious tolerance as state policy at a moment when the rest of the world was burning people at the stake for theological difference. He was, simultaneously, the most destructive force of his age and one of its most consequential architects. History rarely offers clean verdicts. The great currents of human affairs resist the tidy moral conclusions we bring to them, wanting resolution. What history offers instead, in the case of Genghis Khan, is this: consequence. The world he left behind in 1227 was not the world he had entered as a child. It would never be that world again. And his sons and his grandsons were not done. The steppe had only just introduced itself. There is a particular kind of silence that follows the death of a great force of nature, a moment in which the world catches its breath, in which the survivors look at one another across the wreckage and dare, quietly, to hope that the worst is over. The civilizations that survived the campaigns of Genghis Khan, the remnants of the Jin dynasty, the successor states of Khwarezm, the Rus principalities that had watched the Battle of the Khalkhar River from a safe distance and told themselves that the strange horsemen from the east had simply gone away. They breathed that kind of breath in 1227. They were wrong. They were not witnessing the end of the storm. They were standing in its eye. The Mongol succession was never going to be simple. Nothing about the empire was simple, but the machinery Genghis Khan had built was robust enough, at least in its first generation, to survive the transition of power without collapsing. The system he had created called for a great Kurultai, an assembly of the Mongol leadership, to select the next great Khan from among his sons. Before his death, Genghis had expressed a preference for his third son, Ogdi, a man of considerable political intelligence, personal warmth, and the administrative capacity that the empire, at this stage of its development, desperately needed. The Kurultai of 1229 confirmed Ogdi as Great Khan. The empire had also been divided, in its broad strokes, among the sons and the sons of sons. This was the Ulus system, each major branch of the Chinggisid family receiving a portion of territory and the right to administer it, while owing loyalty and military service to the Great Khan. In theory, it was a structure of managed decentralization. In practice, it was the slow ticking of a clock that would, generations later, count down to fragmentation. But that was later. In 1229, the clock was still young, and the empire still had directions left to move. 4 of them, to be precise. The first order of unfinished business was China. The Jin dynasty, badly damaged by the campaigns of Genghis Khan, but not yet destroyed, had retreated to its southern territories and reorganized. The Mongols had the northern plains. The Jin held the middle Yangtze region, sheltering behind the Yellow River and a network of fortified cities that had proved, even against the Mongol army, costly and time-consuming to reduce. Ogdi prosecuted the final phase of the Jin War with methodical patience. He also demonstrated something that would become a recurring feature of Mongol strategic thinking: the willingness to make pragmatic alliances with enemies of enemies. The Southern Song dynasty, which occupied the southern third of China and had spent generations under the shadow of Jin domination, was invited into a joint campaign against their mutual adversary. The Song accepted. It was, from their perspective, a logical choice, and one they would eventually come to regret with a bitterness that consumed generations. But that reckoning, too, was later. In 1234, the last Jin emperor died. His dynasty, which had ruled northern China for over a century, was gone. Ogdi stood in possession of most of China north of the Yangtze River, and Mongol administrators, drawing heavily on the Chinese civil service structures they had absorbed and adapted, began the work of converting conquest into governance. The East was, for the moment, consolidating rather than expanding. The West was about to explode. To understand what happened next in the West, you need to know one name that most people who are not military historians have never heard: Subutai. Subutai the Valiant, son of a blacksmith, one of Genghis Khan's earliest followers. A man who, by the time of the Western campaigns, had already ridden reconnaissance across Persia and the Caucasus and the Russian steppe. A man who, in total, would command forces across more than 65 major engagements across a military career that spanned 4 decades and covered a geographic range that has never been matched by any commander in history. Some scholars of military history, those who make it their business to compare strategists across time and culture, place Subutai above Hannibal, above Caesar, above Napoleon in terms of the breadth, complexity, and consistent success of his operational planning. He is, by any serious accounting, one of the greatest generals who has ever lived. And in 1235, Ogdi gave him a mission. The West was to be finished. The Western campaign, what the Mongols called their drive toward the Great Sea at the edge of the world, was to be prosecuted to its final conclusion. The Rus principalities, the Cumans, the kingdoms of Eastern and Central Europe, whatever lay beyond the horizon to the west, was to be brought under the Mongol standard. Bata Khan, the grandson of Genghis and the nominal commander of the campaign, was given supreme authority. Subutai was given the maps, the intelligence, and the plan. They rode in 1236. The first targets were the Volga Bulgars, a Turkic people occupying the middle Volga River region who had once, years before, managed to repulse a Mongol probe. That earlier repulse was remembered. It was addressed with a thoroughness that left little of the Bulgar state standing. The Cuman people of the open steppe, a Turkic confederation that stretched across the Pontic steppe from the Urals to the Danube, were next. The Mongols had old, complex, and entirely unresolved business with the Cumans. They had fought them before. They had chased their leaders into alliance with the Rus princes. Now, with the full weight of a prepared campaign behind them, the Mongols shattered the Cuman Confederation and drove its people westward in a vast, terrified displacement. Some Cuman groups fled into Hungary, arriving at the court of King Bela IV in such desperate numbers that they fundamentally altered the demographic of the Hungarian plains. The Rus principalities came next. Medieval Rus was not Russia in any modern sense. It was a collection of city-states and principalities: Ryazan, Vladimir, Suzdal, Pereyaslav, Chernihiv, Kiev, connected by trade along the great rivers, occasionally united by dynastic marriage, and almost entirely disunited in any military sense. The princes of Rus had watched what happened at the Kalka River 14 years earlier. Some of them had fought there. They knew the Mongols were real. They simply could not agree on what to do about it. Agreement, as it turned out, was no longer relevant. In the winter of 1237, the Mongol army crossed the frozen Volga River. The choice of winter was deliberate. The frozen rivers and lakes of Rus, which in summer served as natural defensive barriers and logistical obstacles, became in winter a highway system. The Mongol horses, bred for exactly this kind of cold, moved across the ice with a speed and confidence that the defending Rus forces simply could not match. Ryazan was the first to fall. Its prince had sent to his neighboring princes for assistance and received none. He sent to the Great Khan for terms and received demands he could not meet. The city was besieged and, after several days, stormed. The population was massacred or enslaved. The city was burned. The chronicle accounts of Ryazan's destruction survive. They are written in a voice that still carries, across 800 years, the register of total, incomprehensible catastrophe. A voice trying to find language for something that had no precedent. Vladimir fell in February of 1238. The Grand Prince was away attempting to gather forces. His family, sheltering in the city's cathedral, died when the Mongols burned it. Suzdal fell. Pereyaslav fell. Torzhok fell after a 2-week siege. The Mongols turned toward Novgorod, the great commercial city in the northwest, one of the wealthiest in all of Rus. And then, inexplicably, they stopped. The spring thaw was coming. The ground north of Novgorod was dissolving into the kind of swampy, marshy terrain that would trap horses and destroy the mobility that was everything to a Mongol army. Subutai understood supply lines and terrain with the instincts of a man who had spent decades reading the earth beneath him. He turned south. Novgorod survived, not because it was strong enough to resist, because the season shifted and Subutai recognized it. The army wintered on the Pontic steppe, resting and resupplying with a logistical discipline that astonished observers. They were not retreating, they were breathing. In the following year, 1239 and 1240, they resumed. The southern Rus cities, Chernihiv, Pereyaslav, and then Kiev. Kiev was, at this point in history, the most important city in the Rus world. Its roots ran back to the 9th century. It was the mother city of Rus civilization, the seat of its Orthodox Christianity, the center of its culture. A city of perhaps 50,000 people, defended by a population that understood precisely what was coming and chose to defend it anyway. The siege lasted days rather than weeks. The city fell in December of 1240. The destruction was so complete that when the Franciscan friar Giovanni de Pien del Carpine passed through the site 5 years later, on a diplomatic mission to the Mongol court, he reported seeing skulls and bones covering the fields. He estimated that only around 200 houses remained standing. In 5 years, the most formidable military force of the age had swept from the Volga to the Dnieper and eliminated every significant Rus principality in its path. And Subutai was still not finished. He split his forces. This is the decision that, even today, military historians discuss with something approaching awe. In the early spring of 1241, with his eastern flank secured and his army rested, Subutai divided his forces into multiple columns for a coordinated invasion of Central Europe along separate axes, across a front of roughly 300 miles. One force, under Badu's brothers Orda and Baidar, drove into Poland, a northern screening force designed to prevent any Polish-German coalition from swinging south to reinforce the main theater. The main force, under Batu and Subutai, drove into Hungary. What followed across the space of a single week in April of 1241 is something that historians of medieval Europe still discuss with a kind of stunned disbelief. On April 9th, the Northern Screening Force defeated a combined Polish-German army at the Battle of Legnica in Silesia. The army was led by Henry II, Duke of Silesia, a capable commander at the head of some of the finest heavy cavalry in Central Europe. The Mongols destroyed it. Henry was killed. His head was reportedly carried on a pike before the gates of the city. On April 11th, 2 days later, the main Mongol force under Subutai met King Bela IV of Hungary and an army of perhaps 60,000 men at the Battle of Mohi on the banks of the Sejo River. The Battle of Mohi is a masterpiece of Mongol operational art. Bela had positioned his forces in a fortified camp, his flanks anchored on the river, his rear covered by a bridge he believed he controlled. Subutai attacked the bridge frontally as a diversion, keeping Hungarian attention fixed on the crossing. Simultaneously, he crossed the river with the bulk of his forces several miles downstream. In the dark, completing one of the most technically demanding river crossing operations of the medieval period. When dawn came, the Hungarians found themselves surrounded. Subutai, however, did something unexpected. He left a gap in the encirclement, a visible corridor through which the Hungarians could flee. They fled through it, and as they ran, abandoning their camp, their equipment, their formation, their command structure, the Mongol cavalry rode them down across miles of open ground with a systematic efficiency that was worse in terms of casualties than if they had simply stood and fought. Bela escaped. 60,000 men largely did not. 2 major European armies, destroyed in 2 days, by forces that were coordinated across 300 miles of terrain with a precision that the telegraph and the telephone would not improve upon for 600 more years. Europe went into a state of something close to collective panic. The chronicles and letters of 1241 paint a picture that is almost impossible to read without feeling the cold of it. Pope Gregory IX called for a crusade against the Mongols. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II wrote urgent letters to the kings of Europe calling for unified resistance. The letters have survived. They crackle with a fear that the formality of medieval diplomatic Latin cannot quite suppress. In England, the chronicler Matthew Paris recorded that fishermen on the English coast were afraid to put out to sea because the normal flow of trade from the Baltic had ceased. The merchants had stopped moving because no one knew where the Mongols were or when they would appear next. France, Germany, Italy, the heart of medieval Christendom, lay open. There was no army between the Mongol vanguard and the Atlantic coast that had any realistic prospect of stopping what had just destroyed Poland and Hungary in a single week. And then Ogedei Khan died. In December of 1241, at his court in Mongolia, the great Khan died. The causes, the historical sources suggest years of excessive drinking had taken their toll, are less important than the consequences. The law of the Mongol Empire was absolute on one point. When a great Khan died, the senior commanders of the empire were required to return to Mongolia for the Kurultai that would select his successor. Bada Khan had personal reasons to resent this requirement. He was, by many accounts, on the verge of continuing his drive westward. The Mongol army was not exhausted. It was not defeated. It was by every military measure operating at full capacity. But the law was the law, and the law had been made by Genghis Khan himself. They turned east. Europe would debate for centuries whether this was deliverance or merely postponement. Modern historians have noted that the logistical challenges of sustaining the Mongol army across the vast distances of Western Europe would have been genuinely formidable. The horse-carrying capacity of the Hungarian plain, which had sustained the army thus far, did not extend to Germany or France. Subutai, always a logistical realist, may have been planning to consolidate rather than continue immediately. What is not debated is this: Europe was never invaded again. The Kurultai requirement, that quirk of steppe succession law, may have saved Western civilization from the fate of Kiev. While the Western campaign burned through Europe, another horizon was being opened. South and west of the Mongolian heartland, beyond the Persian plateau and the deserts of Mesopotamia, lay the Islamic world, and at its center, the city that had, for 500 years, been the intellectual and political capital of one of the great civilizations on earth. Baghdad, the city of the Abbasid Caliphate, the city that had once been the largest in the world, the city of the House of Wisdom, that extraordinary institution where Greek, Persian, Indian, and Arabic scholarship had flowed together in the 8th and 9th centuries and produced a flowering of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and literature that would eventually fertilize the European Renaissance. In 1255, Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, brother of Kublai and Monk, a man of considerable cultural sophistication who maintained Buddhist and Nestorian Christian wives at his court, rode west from Mongolia at the head of the largest Mongol army ever assembled for a single campaign. His instructions from the great Khan monk were comprehensive: subdue the assassins, bring the caliph to submission, and secure the Islamic world under Mongol authority. The assassins, the Nizari Ismaili sect whose network of mountain fortresses in Persia had made them one of the most feared and destabilizing forces in medieval politics, were destroyed in 1256. Their great fortress at Alamut fell. Their Grand Master was captured. The network of fortresses that had defied every military force for generations was systematically reduced. The assassins, as a political and military power, ceased to exist. Then Hulagu turned toward Baghdad. The Caliph al-Mustasim was not a man equal to the moment that history had placed him in. He received Hulagu's demands for submission with a combination of defiance and miscalculation that reads, at this distance, as almost willfully tragic. He underestimated the Mongol force. He was ill-advised by courtiers who told him what he wanted to hear. He was paralyzed by the theological complexity of his position. The Caliph was not simply a political ruler. He was the spiritual leader of Sunni Islam, a role that carried enormous symbolic weight and created enormous constraints on what kind of compromise was imaginable. He refused to submit. In January of 1258, Hulagu's forces surrounded Baghdad. The siege was brief. The city's defenses, built for an earlier era, were no match for the siege technology the Mongol army had accumulated across generations of campaign. On February 10th, 1258, the walls were breached. What followed over the next several weeks was, by the accounting of the Islamic historians who recorded it, men writing in the immediate aftermath, in conditions of grief and shock, one of the worst catastrophes in the history of the Islamic world. The libraries were burned or scattered. The canals and irrigation systems that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization for millennia were damaged. The scholars, the administrators, the craftsmen, the population of one of the world's great cities, the human infrastructure of centuries of accumulated civilization was shattered in a matter of days. Al-Mustasim was executed. The manner of his death, rolled in a carpet and trampled by horses, a Mongol method of killing nobility without shedding blood, was a final, resonant symbol. The Caliph of the Muslim world, the successor in an unbroken line to the Prophet's companions, killed by steppe custom in the ruins of his own capital. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had endured for over 500 years, ended in February of 1258. It did not recover. There would be successor claimants, and the title would eventually be revived in a different form in a different place. But the institution itself, the caliphate as it had existed as a political and cultural anchor for the Islamic world, was gone. The Muslim chronicler Ibn Kathir, writing in the decades after, described the death toll in numbers that, like the estimates from the Khwarezmian campaign, have been debated by historians ever since. Modern scholarship approaches these figures with rigor and caution, noting that the sources were written in conditions of enormous trauma and political complexity that shaped how losses were recorded. What is not contested is that the destruction was real, the cultural loss was immense, and the psychological impact on the Islamic world was profound and lasting. The Mongols moved on. Syria fell to Hulagu's forces. The great cities of Damascus and Aleppo opened their gates. The entirety of the Fertile Crescent, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast, appeared to be the next in a sequence that had not stopped since 1206. And then, for the first time in the history of the Mongol military machine, it stopped. Not because of a Kurultai requirement this time. Not because of logistics or season or terrain. Because of a battle. The Mamluks of Egypt were not like the opponents the Mongols had faced before. They were themselves a military caste. Soldiers of steppe and Central Asian origin, trained from childhood in exactly the kind of mobile cavalry warfare that the Mongols had used to destroy everyone else. They had watched the Mongols. They had studied them. They had no illusions about what kind of force they were facing. Their Sultan, Qutuz, marched north into Palestine to meet the advancing Mongol force. The Mongol commander in the field was Kitbuka, a Nestorian Christian general, operating with a reduced force because Hulagu had taken the bulk of the army back east following the death of the great Khan monk. Another succession crisis pulling Mongol military power homeward at a critical moment. On September 3rd, 1260, the two armies met at a place called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, a site in the Jezreel Valley of modern Israel that had seen armies pass for thousands of years. The Mamluks deployed with a discipline and tactical sophistication that the Mongols had never encountered from an Islamic opponent. Baybars, the Mamluk field commander, used a feigned retreat, the Mongols' own signature move, to draw the Mongol vanguard into an ambush. The engagement that followed was fierce, costly, and for the first time in the history of the Mongol expansion, concluded with the Mongols in retreat. Kitbuka was captured and executed. The Mongol force was driven back. Ain Jalut did not end the Mongol Empire. It did not even end the Mongol threat to the Islamic world. There would be further campaigns, further battles in the years and decades that followed. But it demonstrated, for the first time, that the Mongol army could be beaten in open field by a prepared, disciplined opponent who had studied their methods and could match their mobility. The psychological weight of that demonstration rippled outward across the Islamic world and has never fully dissipated. Ain Jalut remains, in Arabic historical memory, the battle that saved Islamic civilization. Whether that is precisely accurate as a historical claim or not, it captures something true about the symbolic weight of what happened there. The Western advance of the Mongols had found its limit. There are other limits. Some of them arrived in the form of weather. In 1274, Kublai Khan, by this point the Great Khan and the ruler of the Yuan dynasty in China, launched an invasion of Japan. His forces landed on Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands, and engaged the Japanese defenders. The invasion was ultimately repelled when a severe storm, what the Japanese called kamikaze, the divine wind, struck the Mongol fleet and destroyed a significant portion of it. Kublai tried again in 1281. This time the invasion force was the largest amphibious operation the world had ever seen. A combined fleet of over 4,000 ships carrying roughly 140,000 men, assembled from China, Korea, and the conquered territories. The forces landed, established beachheads, and fought their way into the Japanese interior. And then, again, the storm came. A typhoon of devastating intensity struck the fleet at anchor. The damage was catastrophic. The invasion collapsed. The survivors who could retreated to their ships. Those who could not were killed or captured on the beaches. The Japanese credited the divine wind with saving their nation from conquest. The Mongols never attempted a third invasion of Japan. The logistical cost, the demonstrated vulnerability to weather at sea, and the increasing pressures of administering a vast continental empire had begun to impose a different kind of discipline on Mongol ambition. The campaigns into Vietnam, the Dai Viet Kingdom, also failed not once but 3 times. The dense jungle terrain negated the Mongol cavalry's advantage. The heat destroyed their horses, and the Vietnamese forces, fighting on terrain they knew intimately, used guerrilla warfare with a persistence that exhausted the invaders. The Mongol forces withdrew each time, having won battles but been unable to hold territory. An attempted invasion of Java in 1292 ended similarly. The Mongol forces landed, fought, and eventually withdrew from terrain and conditions that their military system was not designed to master. The world, it turned out, had edges. And some of those edges were not made of walls or armies, but of weather and jungle and sea and the particular kind of resistance that arises when a people are defending the only home they have ever known. Beneath all of this, beneath the campaigns and the battles and the expanding horizon of conquest, the empire had begun, quietly, to change the shape of itself from within. The succession crisis that followed the death of Mongol Khan in 1259 was not merely a political event. It was a moment at which the empire's internal tensions became visible in a new way. Kublai Khan and his younger brother Erik Bok both claimed the title of Great Khan. What followed was the First Mongol Civil War, a 4-year conflict between two visions of what the empire was supposed to be. Erik Bok represented the old steppe tradition, the empire as a nomadic confederation, centered on the Mongolian heartland, true to the values and practices of the steppe. Kublai represented something new, an emperor who was becoming Chinese, who was building cities, who was ruling a settled civilization on its own terms rather than as a conquered subject. Kublai won, but the winning cost something that could not be recovered. The unity of the Chinggisid family, the shared identity of the empire as a single, coherent entity under a single supreme authority, was fractured. The 4 khanates that had been, in theory, provinces of one empire under the Great Khan were becoming, in practice, independent powers. The Ilkhanate in Persia, the Golden Horde on the Russian steppe, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and Kublai's own Yuan dynasty in China. They still shared a family. They still, in some formal sense, acknowledged the theoretical supremacy of the Great Khan, but they went to war with one another. They pursued separate policies. They converted to different religions. The Golden Horde became Muslim. The Ilkhanate became, eventually Muslim. Kublai's court remained a syncretic blend of Buddhist, Confucian, and shamanist traditions. The empire had not yet fallen, but the idea of it as a single unified organism was giving way to something more complicated and less durable. By the 1260s, the Mongol Empire stretched in its various branches from the shores of the Pacific Ocean to the banks of the Danube River, from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the forests north of Moscow. No empire before had ever covered so much of the inhabited earth. No empire before it had ever connected, however violently, however at whatever cost, so many of the world's great civilizations to one another simultaneously. The Russian principalities paid tribute to the Golden Horde. The Persian Ilkhanate traded and warred with the Levant. The Yuan dynasty in China received ambassadors from as far away as Western Europe. And through all of them, along the roads that the Mongol armies had opened and the Mongol postal system was beginning to maintain, something extraordinary was starting to happen. The world was beginning to talk to itself. That conversation, what it contained, what it cost, and what it ultimately built was the next thing the Mongols gave to history. It may have been the most important thing of all. There is a thought experiment that historians of the medieval world occasionally pose to their students. Imagine you are a merchant in the year 1275. You want to travel from the city of Venice on the Adriatic coast of Italy to the city of Canbalic on the northeastern plain of China. A journey of roughly 5,000 miles through some of the most formidable terrain on earth. Before the Mongols, this journey was not merely difficult. It was, for all practical purposes, impossible as a single continuous undertaking. The route passed through dozens of competing kingdoms, hostile territories, warring factions, and ungoverned wilderness. Bandits controlled the mountain passes. Rival powers taxed and harassed merchants at every border. No single authority guaranteed safe passage. No single law protected the traveler once he crossed into the next kingdom's shadow. The journey, if it happened at all, happened in fragments, goods passing through intermediary hands, each exchange adding cost and distortion, so that by the time silk from China reached a market in Venice, the original producer and the final buyer existed in entirely separate worlds with no knowledge of each other whatsoever. Now, imagine the same journey in 1275. The road from Venice to Canbalic passes, for the vast majority of its length, through territory governed by a single legal authority. The Mongol Yam system, a relay network of postal stations positioned roughly every 20 to 30 miles along the major routes, means that messages can travel from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of weeks. Official travelers carry a pesa, a tablet of gold or silver that serves as an imperial passport, guaranteeing them food, shelter, fresh horses, and safe passage at every station along the route. A merchant on this road is not prey. He is, under Mongol law, a protected asset, because the Mongols understood, with a commercial clarity that separated them from almost every other imperial power of their age, that a living, trading merchant was worth more than a robbed one. Marco Polo made this journey, and what he found at the other end of it was a world that most of his contemporaries in Europe could not have imagined existed. Kublai Khan was, by the time Marco Polo arrived at his court in approximately 1275, something that had no precise precedent in history. He was the grandson of the man who had emerged from the Mongolian steppe as the universal ruler of the nomadic world. He was also the emperor of China, the son of heaven, the ruler of the most populous and in many respects the most sophisticated civilization on earth. He was a Mongol who had grown up on the steppe and a monarch who had built a capital city of extraordinary grandeur. He was a man of the old world and the architect of a new one. The tension in that identity was real, and Kublai lived it every day of his reign. The traditional Mongol leadership, the princes and generals who held the old steppe values close, regarded his embrace of Chinese governance with deep suspicion. They saw in his elaborate court rituals, his Confucian advisors, his Chinese bureaucracy, and his magnificent fixed capital a betrayal of everything Genghis Khan had stood for. The steppe was the source. The steppe was the strength. A Khan who forgot the steppe was a Khan who was becoming something else. Kublai understood their concern. He did not ultimately share it. He had looked at the world his grandfather had created and drawn a conclusion that the old steppe generals could not quite reach. That governing a civilization of 50 million people required different tools than conquering it. That the Mongol genius for destruction and mobility, while real and formidable, was insufficient on its own for the task of administration. That the empire, if it was going to be anything more than a temporary phenomenon, needed to become something it had never been. It needed to become a state. Kublai declared the Yuan dynasty in 1271. The name was drawn from the I Ching, the ancient Chinese classic of change and transformation. It meant, roughly, the origin of the universe, the primordial source. It was a Chinese name, chosen deliberately. It was an announcement that the Mongol ruler of China was not a foreign occupier managing a conquered territory at arm's length. He was an emperor in the Chinese tradition, assuming the mandate of heaven, taking on the full weight and ceremony and obligation of that ancient institution. His capital, Kambalik, the city of the Khan, built on the site of the old Jin capital that his grandfather had burned, was designed from its foundations as a crossroads. The city plan was a cosmological statement, oriented to the cardinal directions, its boulevards wide enough for armies, its palace complex enormous enough to contain the administrative apparatus of a continental empire. Markets, temples, workshops, and ambassadorial residences filled the city in organized profusion. It was, by the accounts of everyone who saw it, Chinese, Persian, and European alike, one of the most extraordinary cities in the world. Marco Polo spent 17 years in Kublai's service. He traveled across the empire as an emissary and observer, seeing more of the connected Mongol world than almost any other European of his age. His account, dictated to a writer named Rustic Hello de Pisa while Polo was imprisoned in Genoa years later, is one of the most debated documents in the history of exploration. Did he actually go to China? Some historians have noted the absence of certain details one might expect. No mention of the Great Wall, no mention of chopsticks or tea. Others have pointed out that the wall was not, in this period, the continuous structure it later became, and that his route and role may explain many of the omissions. Still others have suggested his account combined his own observations with the reports of other travelers. The debate is genuine and unresolved. What is not debated is the effect of his account on the European imagination. His description of Kublai's court, of the cities of China, of the wealth and sophistication of the East, produced in European readers a hunger for direct contact with Asia that would, 2 centuries later, motivate a Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus to sail west across the Atlantic, looking for a faster route to the riches Polo had described. The Mongol Road, in other words, planted the seed of the age of exploration. The institution that made the Pax Mongolica function as something more than a military occupation was the yam. The yam was the Mongol imperial postal and relay system, and it was, in the context of the 13th century, a communication technology of world historical significance. Stations were established at regular intervals along all major routes through the empire. Each station maintained a complement of horses, riders, food, and shelter. An official courier carrying a peza could arrive at a station exhausted, hand off his message to a fresh rider on a fresh horse, and the message would continue its journey without pause, day and night, across mountains, deserts, and steppe. The result was an information network of a speed and reliability that the medieval world had never seen. A message from Kambalik could reach Persia in weeks. Imperial commands could be issued and received across the entirety of the Eurasian landmass, with a responsiveness that previous empires had simply never achieved. The yam was not just for official use. It was the backbone of a commercial and diplomatic ecosystem. Merchants with appropriate authorization could use the stations for resupply, for shelter, for information about road conditions and political situations ahead. Ambassadors from foreign powers made their way to Kublai's court along roads that, whatever their origin in conquest, now functioned as arteries of civilization. Ibn Battuta, the great Moroccan traveler who crossed much of the known world in the 14th century, described the road system through the Mongol-influenced territories as more organized and reliably safe for travelers than anything he encountered elsewhere in his extraordinary journeys. He was not a man easily impressed. The roads impressed him. What traveled along these roads was not only silk. The Pax Mongolica was, among other things, the greatest single episode of technology transfer in the history of the pre-modern world. Consider what moved westward across the Mongol network. Printing. The technology of movable type and block printing had been developing in China for centuries. During the Mongol period, printed materials, books, administrative documents, paper currency, moved through the empire in quantities and at speeds that had no precedent. The technology and the idea of it filtered westward through Persian and Islamic intermediaries. Gutenberg's press in the 1540s did not arise from nothing. It arose from a European encounter with the concept of mechanical reproduction of text that had been traveling the Mongol road for 200 years. Paper money. Kublai Khan's government issued paper currency, the chow, on a scale that astonished his European visitors. Marco Polo's description of an emperor who could create money from paper struck his readers as something close to magic. The concept of government-backed paper currency, which would eventually transform global economics, had its medieval demonstration in the Yuan dynasty's financial system. Gunpowder. The Mongols had encountered gunpowder weapons in China and incorporated them into their siege arsenal. As the empire's trade routes carried goods and technicians across Eurasia, knowledge of gunpowder's military applications moved with them. The cannon that would eventually reshape European warfare and end the age of the castle arrived in the Islamic world, and then in Europe along routes that the Mongol expansion had opened. The compass, navigational technology developed in China, moved westward through the same networks. It would eventually reach European sailors and contribute to the navigation of the open ocean. These were not marginal transfers. Each of these technologies would go on to reshape the civilization that received it. The printing press drove the Protestant Reformation. Gunpowder ended feudalism. The compass opened the oceans. Paper money built capitalism. All of them, in some meaningful sense, traveled the Mongol road. The flow was not one-directional. Equally significant, and less often appreciated in Western accounts of this period, was the movement of Islamic and Central Asian knowledge eastward into China and the Mongol court. Kublai Khan was a man of genuine and wide-ranging intellectual curiosity. His court was one of the most diverse intellectual environments in the medieval world, not as a matter of accidental proximity, but of deliberate cultivation. He wanted the best minds from every tradition at his table, because he understood that no single tradition held all the answers. Persian astronomers arrived at the Yuan court and established a bureau of Muslim astronomy. They brought with them centuries of Islamic mathematical and observational tradition, including the astronomical tables and trigonometric methods that had accumulated in the great Islamic centers of learning. Chinese and Islamic astronomy, working in the same imperial institution, produced a synthesis that advanced the state of the art in both traditions. Islamic mathematicians and their transmission of the Hindu-Arabic numeral system, the number system we use today, with its revolutionary concept of zero as a placeholder, moved through Mongol-connected networks into contexts where it encountered an enriched Chinese mathematical tradition. Medical knowledge flowed in both directions. Arab physicians worked alongside Chinese practitioners in the diverse medical environment of Kublai's court. The combination of Islamic medical theory and Chinese pharmacological tradition produced institutional frameworks for medicine that outlasted the empire itself. The Mongol court under Kublai was to a degree that has no parallel in the medieval world, a place where the most advanced minds of multiple civilizations were simultaneously present in conversation and in competition. The sheer density of intellectual cross-pollination in that environment is staggering to contemplate. The European Renaissance, which would begin to flower in Italy within a century of the Pax Mongolica's peak, drew on a recovery of Greek philosophy filtered through Islamic commentary, on mathematical tools developed in the Islamic world and transmitted through trade networks, on technological concepts that had originated in China. The channels through which all of this moved were the channels the Mongols built. To say that the Renaissance was, in part, a Mongol gift to the West is not a romantic exaggeration. It is a recognition of how ideas travel and who clear the roads. Religious tolerance was the quiet revolution running beneath all of this. In 1275, at the court of Kublai Khan in Khanbaliq, you could find Tibetan Buddhist lamas advising the emperor on spiritual matters. Nestorian Christian monks maintaining a chapel within the palace complex. Muslim merchants and administrators occupying positions of significant authority in the imperial bureaucracy. Confucian scholars managing the civil service. Taoist practitioners pursuing their own paths with imperial protection. This was not, it must be said, idealism. Kublai Khan was not operating from a philosophy of universal brotherhood. He was operating from philosophy of systemic stability. A multi-religious, multi-ethnic empire that went to war with itself over theology was an empire that was destroying its own productive capacity. Religious tolerance was, in the cold arithmetic of imperial governance, the most efficient policy available. But the consequences of that pragmatic tolerance were anything but cold. In a world where Christianity was burning heretics, where Islamic governments were managing complex hierarchies of religious permission and restriction, where the politics of religious identity were among the most explosive forces in human affairs, the Mongol court was a place where an Nestorian Christian, a Muslim, a Buddhist, and a Confucian scholar could sit at the same table and argue about astronomy. Not without tension, not without the ever-present weight of a power structure that could descend on any of them at any moment, but in a space of genuine intellectual possibility that had almost no parallel in the medieval world. The letters of the Mongol Khans exchanged with the papacy in the mid-13th century are among the most remarkable documents of the medieval period. The Khans' letters to the popes are written with a directness and a confidence that the popes found deeply unsettling. They are the letters of men who did not consider Christianity to be in possession of any particular cosmic priority. They offered alliance. They offered tolerance. They occasionally offered the popes a chance to submit. The theological assumptions on both sides of that correspondence are a window into how profoundly different these two worlds were, and how consequentially they had collided. There's one more thing that traveled the Mongol road, and this one did not build. It only destroyed. In the 1340s, in the steppe grasslands of Central Asia, Something was moving through the populations of rodents that lived in the vast underground networks of burrows beneath the Mongolian plateau. Something ancient and patient and extraordinarily lethal when it found its way into a human body. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium we know as the cause of bubonic plague. Plague was not new to Asia. There have been episodes throughout history of what may have been the disease erupting in localized populations. But the 1340s saw something different, something that moved with a speed and range that had no precedent. The Mongol trade network, the very infrastructure of connection and commerce and communication that had been the Pax Mongolica's greatest achievement, was also the most efficient disease transmission system the medieval world had ever possessed. The Yam stations, positioned every 20 to 30 miles across the entirety of Eurasia, were designed to move goods and people as fast as possible. They did not distinguish between silk and spores. The merchant caravans that traveled the protected roads of the empire carried rats in their grain supplies and fleas on their bodies, as merchants had always done. The difference was that now those caravans were moving farther, faster, and with fewer interruptions than at any previous point in history. The plague moved west along the Mongol trade routes through Central Asia and Persia. It reached the Crimean Peninsula by approximately 1346, where a Mongol siege of the Genoese trading colony of Kaffa, a siege that was itself a demonstration of how thoroughly the Italian city-states had embedded themselves in the Mongol commercial network, may have contributed to the disease's transmission to European sailors who then carried it home. By 1350, the Black Death had swept through most of Europe. Conservative modern estimates suggest that it killed roughly 1/3 of the European population. Some regions lost half or more of their inhabitants. The demographic, economic, psychological, and social consequences were so profound that historians have identified the Black Death as one of the pivots on which medieval European civilization turned into something recognizably pre-modern. The labor shortages it created empowered the surviving peasantry in ways that centuries of political negotiation had not managed. The death of so many clergy accelerated the authority crisis of the church that would eventually produce the Reformation. The disruption of existing economic relationships created the conditions for new commercial structures to emerge. The plague did not come from nowhere. It came from a steppe, and it traveled on the road that the Mongols built. This is the bitterest irony at the heart of the Pax Mongolica, and must be held in full. The same roads that carried the printing press carried the plague. The same network that transmitted algebra transmitted the bacterium. The same postal system that connected the courts of the known world delivered, along with the silk and the spices and the ideas and the diplomats, the most devastating pandemic in human history. Connection, it turns out, is not inherently good or evil, is simply powerful. The power to transmit is indifferent to the content of what it transmits. The Mongols built the most connected world that had ever existed, and that world experienced both the greatest exchange of knowledge in its history and the worst biological catastrophe in its history through exactly the same mechanism. This is not a lesson that diminishes what the Pax Mongolica achieved. It is a lesson that tells the truth about what connection actually means. It is a lesson that the modern world, with its own networks of extraordinary speed and reach, has not finished learning. Kublai Khan died in 1294. He was 79 years old. He had ruled the Yuan dynasty for more than 30 years. He had presided over a court that was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary environments in the history of human civilization. He had failed in Japan, in Vietnam, in Java. He had watched the unity of the empire. He inherited fracture further with each passing decade. He had become, in the eyes of many of the old Mongol nobility, something that was not entirely Mongol anymore. He had also built Kambalik. He had maintained the trade routes. He had kept the roads open. He had sat at the center of a web of connection that stretched from the Pacific to the Mediterranean and had, for a generation, made it possible for the knowledge and the goods and the ideas of one civilization to reach another with a directness and a speed that would not be seen again until the age of the steamship. There is a poem that survives from his court, a Chinese poem written in the elegant classical tradition about autumn and the passage of time and the melancholy of power. Whether Kublai wrote it himself or commissioned it, it carries in its imagery the particular sadness of a man who has built something enormous and can feel, in his final years, the enormity beginning to exceed his grasp. The world he had made was already changing. The khanates were diverging. The trade routes were beginning to feel the friction of political fragmentation. The successors who would follow him onto the Yuan throne were, with few exceptions, men of diminishing capacity and diminishing vision. The Great Road was still open, but the man who had most fully understood what it was was gone. What remains, then, when we stand back and take the full measure of the Pax Mongolica? It was, first, a demonstration of what becomes possible when a single authority controls enough of the Earth's surface to override the friction of borders. For roughly 75 years, from approximately 1250 to approximately 1325, with the years around 1275 as its fullest flowering, a merchant, a scholar, a diplomat, or a pilgrim could move across 5,000 miles of the Eurasian continent with a legal protection and a logistical support that would not exist again until the modern era. In those 75 years, more knowledge moved between more civilizations than in any comparable period before. The Chinese technologies that would underpin the European Renaissance and, eventually, the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution, they moved in those 75 years. The mathematical tools that would make modern science possible, they moved in those 75 years. The commercial concepts, the diplomatic precedents, the simple human knowledge that people on the other side of the world were not monsters, but merchants and scholars and parents and farmers. That moved too. It is not fashionable, perhaps, to describe the legacy of conquest in terms of intellectual gift. The cost of the Pax Mongolica, in lives destroyed, in cities burned, in civilizations shattered to create the roads that carried the learning, was real and enormous and must never be papered over with the romance of what came after. But history demands that we hold both truths simultaneously. The road was built on devastation, and the road carried wonders. The world that came after the Pax Mongolica, the world of the Renaissance, the world of gunpowder empires, the world of oceanic exploration, the world of the printing press and the scientific revolution. That world was shaped in ways it is never fully acknowledged by the roads that nomads built on the Mongolian steppe, and by the grandson of an abandoned boy who sat on a throne in Kambalik and tried, with imperfect and costly tools, to hold the world together. He almost managed it, and what leaked through his fingers as the empire began to come apart was not wasted. It became us. All empires end. This is the one truth that history delivers without exception, without mercy, and without regard for the scale of what was built or the genius of the hands that built it. Rome ended. Persia ended. The empire of Alexander, which his generals divided among themselves before his body was cold, ended before it had properly begun. The British Empire, on which the sun was once said never to set, is now a constitutional monarchy on a medium-sized island in the North Atlantic. Empires end, not because they are weak, often precisely because they were strong, because the very force that built them creates conditions their successors cannot manage, expectations their institutions cannot meet, a geography their governance cannot hold. The Mongol Empire ended, but how it ended and what it left behind when it did, and what the world looks like today, because it existed at all, that is a story that is still unfolding. A story whose last chapter has not yet been written, because we are living inside it. The fracture did not announce itself. It arrived the way most great endings arrive, gradually and then all at once. The seeds had been planted in the succession crises of the mid-13th century, in the civil war between Kublai and Erik Bok, in the growing divergence of the four great khanates as they embedded themselves in the civilizations they had conquered and began, inexorably, to be shaped by what they had set out to shape. The Ilkhanate in Persia is perhaps the most instructive case. Hulagu Khan and his immediate successors had destroyed Baghdad, shattered the Abbasid Caliphate, and installed themselves as rulers over one of the oldest and most sophisticated civilizations on Earth. Persia, with its traditions of poetry and philosophy and statecraft reaching back to Cyrus and Darius, did not simply submit to its new rulers. It absorbed them. Within 2 generations, the Ilkhans were Persian in everything but ancestry. They spoke Persian. They patronized Persian poets and architects and miniaturists. They adopted Persian administrative structures that had survived every previous conquest because they were simply too useful and too elegant to discard. And in 1295, the Ilkhan Ghazan converted to Islam. The conversion was not merely personal. It was political and civilizational. The Ilkhanate, which had destroyed the greatest institution of Sunni Islam in the sack of Baghdad, became an Islamic state. The grandsons of Alagu were Muslims. The court that had once sheltered Nestorian Christians and Buddhists and shamanists now organized itself around the faith of the people it had conquered. This was not failure. It was transformation, but transformation of a kind that dissolved the connective tissue between the Khanates. A Muslim Ilkhanate and a Buddhist-inflected Yuan dynasty were not, in any meaningful sense, the same empire. They were successor states wearing the same family name. The clock that had been ticking since the Kurultai of 1229 had counted down to something new. The Golden Horde followed a similar arc, though on a different timeline and in a different key. Established on the Pontic and Caspian steppe, the same grasslands that the Mongol cavalry had swept across in its drive toward Europe. The Golden Horde was, in its geography, the Khanate most similar to the original Mongol world. Open steppe, mobile populations, a power base in pastoral nomadism rather than in the administration of dense settled civilization. For much of the late 13th and 14th centuries, it was also the most durable of the Khanates. Its khans extracted tribute from the Russian principalities with a consistency that shaped the political development of the Rus world for over 2 centuries. The relationship between the Golden Horde and the Russian princes was not simple domination. It was a complex system of tribute, political legitimation, and occasional alliance in which the Mongols held the ultimate authority but relied on Russian princes to collect taxes and maintain order. The effect on Russia was profound and, in the eyes of Russian historians, deeply contested. The Mongol period, what Russian historiography calls the Tatar yoke, lasted from the 1230s to the 1480s in its effective form. 2.5 centuries during which the Russian principalities operated in the shadow of steppe power. 2.5 centuries during which Moscow, initially a minor principality, gradually emerged as the dominant Rus power in part by making itself useful to the Golden Horde as a tax collector and intermediary. When Ivan III finally stopped paying tribute to the Golden Horde in 1480, he was not simply throwing off a foreign yoke. He was inheriting it, the centralized, autocratic model of Russian governance that he consolidated and that his successors would develop into the Tsar state, bore the unmistakable imprint of 2 centuries of Mongol political culture. The very words are derived from Caesar, but the administrative reality it described owed at least as much to the Khan. Russia, in this reading, did not simply survive the Mongol period. Russia was partially built by it. The Golden Horde itself underwent the same civilizational absorption as the Ilkhanate. By the early 14th century, its Khans too had converted to Islam. The steppe culture remained, but filtered now through an Islamic framework that connected the Golden Horde to the broader world of Turkic and Islamic civilization rather than to the Buddhist and shamanist traditions of the Mongolian heartland. Fragmentation came not just between the Khanates, but within them. The Golden Horde in the later 14th century was a state in which rival claimants to the throne warred constantly, in which the underlying power was increasingly wielded by military strongmen rather than by legitimate Chinggisid heirs, and in which the logistical coherence that had once made the Mongol military machine invincible was eroding from within. Into this fragmentation rode a man who believed he could reverse it. His name was Timur. In the West, he is known as Tamerlane, a corruption of Timur-Lang, Timur the Lame, a reference to the wounds he had suffered in his early military career. He was not a Mongol by blood. He was a Turco-Mongol from the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and he claimed his legitimacy through marriage to Chinggisid princesses rather than through direct descent. He was, in terms of raw military capacity, extraordinary. In the last decades of the 14th century and the opening years of the 15th, Timur swept across Central Asia, Persia, the Caucasus, northern India, and Anatolia with a violence that rivaled, and in some cases exceeded the original Mongol campaigns in its immediate devastation. He destroyed the remnants of the Golden Horde. He sacked Delhi. He defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid I at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, a victory that briefly paralyzed the Ottoman expansion into Europe and may have bought Constantinople a 50-year reprieve. He rebuilt Samarkand into one of the most magnificent cities in the Islamic world, a capital of extraordinary architectural beauty that stands today as a testament to the cultural ambition that ran alongside his appetite for destruction. Timur called himself the restorer of the Mongol legacy. He saw himself as the heir to Genghis Khan, completing the project that the great fragmentation had interrupted. He was not. What he built was a personal empire held together by his own extraordinary energy and military genius, a talent that was real and formidable and entirely non-transferable. When he died in 1405, en route to what would have been an invasion of China, his empire began to dissolve almost immediately. His successors, the Timurids, were remarkable patrons of art and architecture, presiding over a cultural flowering in Central Asia that produced some of the finest Persian poetry and miniature painting ever created. But they were not conquerors, and without the engine of conquest, the Timurid realm shrank and fragmented until it was, within a century of Timur's death, a collection of city-states rather than an empire. The attempt to revive the Mongol project had produced, in the end, only its echo. The Yuan dynasty in China followed its own trajectory toward dissolution, and it did so with a momentum that in retrospect seems almost inexorable. Kublai Khan's successors were, with limited exceptions, men ill-equipped for the task they had inherited. The Yuan court became increasingly faction-ridden. The emperors came and went with a speed that made coherent governance difficult. Between 1294 and 1332, the throne changed hands 9 times. The brilliant administrative synthesis that Kublai had built, Mongol military power married to Chinese bureaucratic tradition, required a ruler of exceptional capacity to hold together. It did not receive one. The Yellow River flooded catastrophically in the 1340s, displacing millions of people and destroying the agricultural infrastructure of the North China Plain. Drought and famine followed. The economic disruption of the Black Death, moving along the trade routes of the Pax Mongolica, reached China as well, with devastating demographic consequences. And from the suffering of the Chinese peasantry rose, as it had risen before and would rise again, a movement that Chinese history called a change in the mandate of heaven. The belief, fundamental to Chinese political thought, that a dynasty rules by divine sanction and loses that sanction when it can no longer provide for its people. The mandate of heaven had not been kind to the Yuan. The Red Turban movement, a peasant rebellion infused with Buddhist millennial ideology, spread across central and southern China in the 1350s and 1360s. From its ranks emerged a man of genuinely extraordinary ability, a former Buddhist novice and beggar named Zhu Yuanzhang, who built, from the chaos of rebellion, the coalition and the military force that would end Mongol rule in China. In 1368, Zhu Yuanzhang's forces took Kambalik. The last Yuan emperor fled north, back to the Mongolian steppe, without a decisive battle, the dynasty collapsing inward rather than being dramatically overthrown. Zhu Yuanzhang became the Hongwu emperor, founder of the Ming dynasty. And one of the Ming dynasty's most consequential decisions was its deliberate, systematic retreat from the Mongol model of openness and connection. The Ming closed the trade routes. They restricted foreign commerce. They turned China inward, building walls, literal walls. The Great Wall in its most familiar form is largely a Ming construction, against the steppe world from which the Mongols had come. The Silk Road, as a managed, institutionally supported artery of east-west commerce, began to wither. The road that had carried the Renaissance westward was being closed from the eastern end. The closing of the Mongol road would have consequences that neither the Ming emperors nor the European merchants who suddenly found their eastern connections disrupted could have fully anticipated. European demand for Asian goods, spices, silk, porcelain, had not diminished. If anything, the decades of the Pax Mongolica had created appetites that the closing of the overland routes could not satisfy. The intermediaries who controlled the remaining routes, the Mamluks of Egypt, the Ottoman Turks who took Constantinople in 1453, were costly and unreliable partners who could not be bypassed on land. So Europe went to sea. The Portuguese, sailing south along the African coast in search of a route to Asia that bypassed the Islamic middlemen, rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488. Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498. Columbus, sailing west in search of the lands that Marco Polo had described, the lands at the other end of the Mongol road, encountered instead a continent that the Mongol network had never reached. The age of exploration was, in a very direct sense, the world's response to the closing of the Mongol road. It was an attempt to find alternative routes to the connections that the Pax Mongolica had created and the Ming closure had severed. The maritime empires that resulted, Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, English, would go on to build a new kind of global network. A network of ships rather than horses. A network that would eventually connect every inhabited continent rather than just Eurasia. A network that would carry not only goods and ideas, but also the violence and exploitation of colonial domination. The world the maritime empires built was different from the world the Mongols built. But it would not have been built at all, or not when it was, without the hunger for connection that the Mongol road had first awakened. The last of the major successor states were absorbed or dissolved across the 15th and 16th centuries. The Ilkhanate had already fragmented in the 1330s. The Golden Horde's effective power over Russia ended with Ivan III in 1480 and the remnant Khanates, Kazan, Astrakhan, Crimea, Sibir, were absorbed by the expanding Russian state across the 16th century under Ivan IV, the Terrible, in campaigns that had their own brutal echoes of the original Mongol model. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia dissolved into smaller successor states, one of which produced, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, another extraordinary individual of Chinggisid lineage, Babur, a prince of the Fergana Valley who lost his ancestral territories, wandered Central Asia with a remnant army for years, and eventually rode south into India to found the Mongol Empire. The empire, whose name is simply the Persian word for Mongol. The Mongol Empire at its peak, under Akbar the Great and his successors, was one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated states in the world. It governed roughly a quarter of the global population. Its administrative structures, its legal traditions, its culture of religious accommodation, the famous Mughal policy of Sul-e-Kul, peace with all, bore the recognizable imprint of the Mongol political inheritance, filtered through generations of Persian and Indian cultural transformation. The Mongols had ended as a unified empire in the 14th century. Their political DNA was still governing a quarter of humanity in the 17th. What then do we make of the inheritance? It is worth standing back at this distance of 7 or 8 centuries and taking the full measure of what the Mongol Empire changed about the world. Not the history of the Mongol Empire, but the history of everything that came after it, which means the history of us. The modern nation-states of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, are built on demographic and cultural foundations that the Mongol period shaped. The populations that live there, the ethnic compositions, the linguistic landscapes, the political habits, all of them were formed in part by the migrations, the settlements, and the administrative decisions of the Mongol centuries. Russia's political culture, its tradition of strong, centralized authority, its historical wariness of invasion from the east, its complex relationship with the concept of empire, was formed in the crucible of 2.5 centuries of Mongol domination and shaped by the state structures that the Russian princes built in the process of throwing off and then inheriting the Mongol model. China's Ming dynasty, in its very rejection of the Mongol period, defined itself against the Yuan in ways that shaped Chinese foreign policy and cultural attitude for centuries. The Great Wall is not just a military structure. It is a statement, a civilization declaring that it has decided where it ends and the steppe begins, and that it intends to enforce that boundary with stone. The Ottoman Empire, which rose in part from the political vacuum created by the Mongol disruption of the Seljuk world, became the dominant power of the medieval Islamic world and the Eastern Mediterranean for 6 centuries. The Ottomans were not Mongols, but the world in which they rose and the power vacuum they filled was a Mongol creation. The European Renaissance drew on mathematical, philosophical, and technological knowledge that had traveled the Mongol road. The age of exploration was motivated, in part, by the desire to recover the connections that the Mongol road had provided. The printing press, gunpowder, the compass, 3 of the technologies most responsible for the shape of the modern Western world, all traveled through Mongol-connected networks. The modern world is, in ways it rarely acknowledges, a Mongol construction. There is one more dimension of this inheritance that science has only recently begun to map. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a team of geneticists analyzing DNA samples from populations across a vast swath of Asia from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea made a discovery that stopped the scientific community in its tracks. Approximately 8% of the men living in that region, a number corresponding to roughly 16 million people at the time of the study, and derived from an estimated population at the time of the Mongol Empire, share a remarkably similar Y chromosome pattern. A genetic signature that can be traced back through the logic of population genetics to a single male ancestor living in Mongolia approximately 1,000 years ago. The identity of that ancestor is not genetically provable, but the historical context is not subtle. The geographic distribution of the signature corresponds with near-perfect precision to the territories of the Mongol Empire at its height. The timing corresponds with near-perfect precision to the Mongol period. The ancestor whose genetic signature 16 million people carry may be Genghis Khan himself, or it may be one of his male relatives or descendants. The Chinggisid lineage was vast, and its members held power across the empire in ways that would have produced exactly this kind of genetic dispersal. What the genetics tells us, whatever its precise origin, is this: the Mongol Empire left a biological mark on the human species that is still measurable today. The largest empire in history produced, quite literally, some of the most widely distributed human DNA on Earth. The abandoned boy on the Onan River, who had nothing and no one, left 800 years later a genetic legacy shared by 16 million living human beings. History, occasionally, has a sense of scale that takes the breath away. Mongolia today is a nation of roughly 3 million people. It sits between 2 of the world's great powers, Russia to the north, China to the south, and navigates the complex geopolitics of that position with a combination of diplomatic skill and fierce independence. It is one of the most sparsely populated nations on Earth. Its capital, Ulaanbaatar, holds roughly half the entire national population, a concentration produced by the economic migrations of the post-Soviet period. Outside the capital, the steppe still stretches to the horizon. Nomadic herders still move with their animals through the seasons, still living in jairs, still reading the weather with the inherited fluency of people whose survival has depended on that skill for 10,000 years. Genghis Khan is everywhere in modern Mongolia. His face is on the currency. His name is on the airport. A stainless steel equestrian statue of him, 40 meters high, stands on the steppe about 50 kilometers from Ulaanbaatar, the largest equestrian statue in the world, visible from miles away, gleaming on the plain. To Mongolians, he is not primarily the conqueror that Western and Chinese and Islamic historiography has emphasized. He is the founder, the man who took a collection of warring tribes and made them a nation, the man whose name and whose empire gave a small, remote people a place in the story of the world that is entirely disproportionate to their numbers or their geography. The pride is real. The complexity is also real. Mongolia's neighbors remember the Mongol period differently. In China, in Iran, in Russia, in the nations of Central Asia, the memory of the Mongol conquest carries a weight of loss and trauma that has not been entirely resolved by the passage of centuries. The cities that were destroyed, the populations that were killed or displaced, the civilizations that were shattered and never entirely recovered their pre-Mongol form. These memories are not wrong. They are not distortions produced by historical grievance. They are the other side of the same story. The task that history sets for us, the task it always sets when confronted with a force as enormous and as consequential as the Mongol Empire, is to hold both sides simultaneously. Not to choose between the legacy of connection and the legacy of destruction. Not to resolve the paradox into a verdict, but to stand in front of the full complexity of it and refuse to look away. The scholarly reassessment of the Mongol Empire that has been underway for the past several decades has been, in this regard, one of the more honest reckonings that academic history has produced. For much of the period following the empire's collapse, the dominant narrative in Western and Chinese and Islamic historiography was what scholars now call the Black Legend, an accounting that emphasized the destruction almost exclusively, that portrayed the Mongols as a force of pure negation, a catastrophe visited upon civilization rather than a complex actor within it. That narrative was not invented. It was grounded in real events and real devastation, recorded by real survivors in real conditions of grief and shock. It deserves to be taken seriously, but it was incomplete. It omitted the administrative genius, the religious tolerance, the commercial vision, the technological transmission, the extraordinary human story of a people who emerged from one of the most demanding environments on Earth and, in the span of a single human lifetime, built a structure that connected more of humanity than any previous construction in history. The reassessment does not erase the destruction. It places it in a frame large enough to contain the whole truth. Jack Weatherford, the anthropologist whose work on Genghis Khan did much to shift the popular understanding of the Mongol period in the early 2000s, argued that the modern world is, in important senses, the Mongols' invention. That free trade, diplomatic immunity, international law, religious tolerance, and the free flow of information. The foundational principles of the international order we attempt, imperfectly, to maintain today, have their medieval demonstration in the Mongol Empire. This is a large claim. It can be overstated. The institutions of the modern world have many parents, and the Mongols are one among many rather than the single origin. But the claim is not baseless. And the fact that it needs to be made at all, that the Mongol contribution to the architecture of the modern world is so persistently underacknowledged, says something about how we tell the story of human civilization, about whose suffering we count and whose innovation we remember, about the stories we find comfortable and the stories we find easier to set aside. And so we return, at the end, to the steppe. The Onon River still runs through northeastern Mongolia. Its banks are lined with birch and larch. In spring, when the snow melts in the mountains and the river runs high and cold and green, the plains that surround it are as they have been for 10,000 years, open, enormous, indifferent to the passage of empires. A boy was born near here in the year 1162, give or take. He was given a name taken from a defeated enemy. He was abandoned with his mother on this steppe at the age of 9. He was enslaved. He was hungry. He was cold. He survived all of it by learning, with a precision and a thoroughness that amounted to genius, how the world actually worked, how people chose their loyalties, how power flowed and pooled and turned, how fear and hope operated on human beings under conditions of extremity, how a system built on merit rather than blood could draw the best capacities from the widest possible range of human beings and direct them toward a common purpose. He learned all of this on the steppe, and then he applied it to the world. The world was not prepared. It never is for the thing it has not seen before. In the span of a single lifetime, the world this boy shaped grew from a loose confederation of warring steppe tribes to the largest land empire in human history. An empire that reached from the Pacific coast of Asia to the Adriatic Sea. An empire that, in its maturity, carried more of the world's knowledge across more of the world's surface than any previous human institution. And then it fragmented, and then it dissolved. And then it became the world that made the world we live in now. The Mongols did not build with stone. They built with movement, which is harder to see and harder to remember and harder to monument, but more durable in its ultimate effects than anything carved from marble or fired from brick. They built with roads. Roads that were also networks of trust and enforcement and commerce. Roads that carried silk and spices and algebra and gunpowder and plague and the seeds of the Renaissance westward across 5,000 miles of Eurasian continent. They built with the radical, pragmatic, world-altering idea that the people you conquered were more valuable to you alive and working than dead and mourned. That a skilled engineer from China and a mathematician from Persia and a merchant from Venice and a diplomat from the papal court were all assets to be absorbed and deployed rather than obstacles to be eliminated. They built with tolerance, not the warm, idealistic tolerance of philosophy, but the cold, functional tolerance of a system that had learned, on the steppe, that survival required the ability to use what the world offered, whatever form arrived in. And they built with something that is harder to name, but runs through the entire story, from the abandoned boy, to the great Khan, to the fractured Khanates, to the genetic signature carried by 16 million people today. They built with the human refusal to accept that the world, as it is, must be the world as it will always be. That refusal, that extraordinary and dangerous and world-altering refusal, is the Mongol gift to history. The empire is dust. The cities they burned have been rebuilt or have grown new cities on their ruins. The roads they opened have been closed and reopened and paved and flown over and forgotten and rediscovered. The specific political structures they built have dissolved into the deep substrate of the modern world, still shaping the behavior of nations and the memories of peoples who may not know where the habit came from. But the horse hoofbeats on a Mongolian steppe, that sound that once made the medieval world stop and turn and feel the cold move through it, those echoes have not stopped. They're in the structure of the Russian state and the foundation of the Ottoman legacy, in the DNA of 16 million living people, in the mathematics that underlies our science, in the technology that shapes our daily lives, in the hunger for connection across distance that built the modern world and that we are still, with mixed results and enormous consequences, pursuing today. Listen carefully enough, and you can still hear them. The boy from the Onan River, the nomads who built history's largest land empire, the road that connected the world, still moving, still reaching, still carrying whatever the world places upon them across the enormous, indifferent, endlessly breathing steppe.